In mounting this session, we're all well aware that calls for a ceasefire and negotiations have been controversial. Calls for negotiations to end a war should not really be controversial, but in this case they are, and to some extent understandably so, because in much of the public discourse about the war, such calls have been characterized as appeals to stop hostilities, after which negotiators would simply acquiesce to whatever battlefield situation happened to be at the time. That clearly is not what is intended. A ceasefire is not a final settlement, but it is essential for clearing a path to a more rigorous peace process and a carefully deliberated outcome, a path which Russia and Ukraine should be urged and even pressured to take, recognizing, and this is important, that it must ultimately be for Ukrainians to lead the process that determines their future. In organizing this event and aware of the challenges, we tried to stay focused on a few basic assumptions or principles that should inform any peace process. The first of these was that we must surely make a clear affirmation of the UN Charter principle that it is illegitimate and illegal to try to change borders or regimes by sheer force of arms. The principle is unambiguous, but asserting it from our vantage point also calls for a healthy dose of humility. If we think of the fractured strategic environment that preoccupies us these days, we have to recognize that violations of this principle have in the not too distant past been perpetrated on both sides of that divide. Nevertheless, it is entirely appropriate and necessary for us to hold up and insist upon the vision of an international order in which the militarily powerful do not get to on their own redraw boundaries or replace governments. Second, I think it's fair to assume that in any Pugwash-inspired discussion of war and peace, there's bound to be a fundamental wariness of the notion that there are military solutions available to resolve the complex political strategic challenges and conflicts that now bedevil the strategic environment. So we quite properly come to any discussion of this extraordinarily destructive war and the suffering it has inflicted on Ukraine, deeply skeptical of expectations that it could yet lead to a clear, never mind just outcome. The suffering that war imposes should itself make efforts to silence the guns a matter of great urgency, and to that urgency must be added the extraordinary risks to which ongoing war exposes the international order, the threat of widening war, the risk of nuclear use, the degrading of fundamental principles of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I'll mention just one more assumption already alluded to, and that is the fundamental obligation on the part of the international community to ensure that a ceasefire not lock in the military status quo of the moment and just leave justice behind. It is Ukrainians who in the end must decide their own fate and define the outlines of an acceptable settlement. And we know that process is bound to also confront decisions on acceptable compromises to be made. It is, after all, highly unlikely that either side will be in a position to dictate terms of a settlement. And if there is going to be any chance of reaching a reasonably just settlement, even if well short of perfection, the international community will have to be as present and engaged and as determined and consequential in diplomacy and peace building as it has been in pursuit of a military solution. Stating principles is, of course, much easier than ensuring they are honored in the real world, but principles do shape our collective aspirations and help us to see the obstacles that have to be faced And in our own deliberations today, we'll try to understand the possibilities and the challenges that we face.
And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I think I will speak on behalf of all Ukrainians, but also on my behalf as a peace builder and a person who has been working in Ukraine since 2014, since the first Russian aggression happened. And I think no country in the world yearns for peace more right now than Ukraine. But we also know that real peace must be just and lasting. And long-lasting peace is possible only after Russian Federation compensates for the damages caused to Ukraine, and Ukraine, the West, and Russian Federation create effective mechanisms that will guarantee security, and it will eliminate all the risk of repeated aggression by the Russian Federation. But I also absolutely agree with Wolfgang that the conflict is not ripe enough right now to be able to proceed with ceasefire. And I think the most obvious problem with recent proposals to freeze the conflict is the fact that a ceasefire would leave 1/5 of Ukraine under Russian control and condemn millions of Ukrainians to a bleak and uncertain future under indefinite Russian occupation. And United investigators have already confirmed that Russia is guilty in committing war crimes in Ukraine. And many observers believe that the ultimate objective of the invasion is the genocide of the Ukrainian nation. Negotiations with Moscow are possible only after the Russian occupying forces leave Ukrainian territory, stop the bombing, stop the killings. Therefore, I see a number of obstacles for the ceasefire. First of all, from Ukrainian perspective, and I'm going to repeat myself, but the primary obstacle to ending the conflict is the Russian aggression. In 2014, Ukraine already emphasized that Russian annexation of Crimea and its support for separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine were violations of our territorial integrity and sovereignty. Russia continued military presence and support for the rebels in DPR and LPR, Donetsk People Republic and Lugansk People Republic, have made it difficult to negotiate a ceasefire or a peaceful agreement even back then, 8 years ago. So recent full-scale invasion just confirmed that. And another crucial obstacle to negotiation is Russia's rigidity and its warm aims, which combine territorial, ideological, and strategic demands. The annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions last September, only partially controlled by Russian forces, established a pretext for additional territorial demands. Therefore, the withdrawal of Russian troops from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine is a basic condition for our country negotiations with the aggressor state. The second one is humanitarian concerns. The conflict had a significant humanitarian impact on the people of Ukraine, all across Ukraine, resulting in a number of refugees and internally displaced persons, in particular people living at the front lines in the east. There have been a number of casualties. Many people have been displaced from their homes. Children have been stolen, and people have undergone through the filtration camps. This humanitarian crisis can make it difficult to reach any ceasefire because our side is reluctant to make concessions that could be seen as compromising our interest or our security.
I have said in the past, and I will say it here again, just the fact that the conflict is not ripe for a solution does not mean that the sides cannot start negotiations for humanitarian purposes to mitigate as much as possible human suffering. There are actual negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, between Russian and Ukrainian military representatives sitting in one room, going on in Istanbul, Turkey, over grain exports, limited to grain exports. I see no reason, no military, no political reason why such negotiations cannot be extended to other areas. First of all, I would talk about security zones around nuclear power plants. Secondly, I would talk about security zones around hospitals, around education institutions. This can then lead to small temporary ceasefires. A ceasefire for Easter, 3 days. A ceasefire for sowing the fields. Farmers in Ukraine are sick and tired of having to go to the fields to sow their fields and being afraid of shelling and of being attacked. And so do farmers on the other side of the front line that is currently under Russian occupation, for your information. Now, these steps could be small steps that will not bring peace, but that will bring three things. These small steps would, first of all, establish a culture of dialogue and re-establish tiny bits of trust. The trust in the Russian Federation on behalf of Ukraine is currently at zero, by seeing, okay, that temporary ceasefire was kept. That hospital was indeed not shelled. The harvest was respected. Such small steps could be gone to re-establish a little bit of trust, paving the way for a real ceasefire. Secondly, this would gravely reduce the risk of nuclear escalation, as is there. It's being very often talked about as if we don't want to talk about it, but it is very much there. Because when sides actually sit around the table, whatever they are talking about, it is an opportunity to establish, certain baselines, to establish certain also unofficial red lines. So that would be the second big advantage of such an approach. And I repeat, this would not have any disadvantages for any of the sides. They would not forego the possibility to continue fighting. They would not forego the possibility to continue making the demands the sides are making. That's number one. And the second one is, of course, a hard one. The second one is a really hard one. And this is one where Russia and Ukraine themselves are, I think, only bystanders and not central players, both of them. And this is to have an honest and taboo-free debate about a future European security architecture, about a future functioning European security architecture, in which the European Union, ideally including Ukraine, can feel safe, but also where Ukraine can feel safe until it actually joins the European Union, which will be a while, let's be realistic, but a security architecture in which also Russia can feel safe and does not feel threatened. This seems a little bit utopic at the moment, but this should be the goal of such a discussion. Such a discussion would show serious divisions in Europe, serious divisions between European states and the United States. All of this is now being kind of plastered over by the only thing we can actually agree upon, and that's solidarity with Ukraine as long as it takes, rightly so, but that covers so much, and actually bringing up these painful topics would be another step towards an actual peace. So humanitarian negotiations, both sides need to be pushed to them by their respective allies. They need to be pushed. Ukraine needs to be pushed by the West. Russia needs to be pushed by China and India, if that's at all possible, without foregoing any other opportunities, without foregoing the possibility to fight. So diplomacy during combat operations and a debate about the European security architecture.
But of course, we must be creative if we want to achieve any solution. I think that as the economic, social costs increase, and political costs too, increase for both sides in the war, and also pressure for negotiated solution grows, it is reasonable to suppose that both belligerents would favor evolving to a ceasefire, if they can be convinced of that, and if the costs rise for them. The catch here is that each one seems to be thinking that the time is not right for any initiative on their side, on their part, with minimal chances of success. Accounts from observers of the operations on the ground believe that each is currently mounting new offensives that they hope would give me an edge in a future negotiated settlement. That may prove illusory, But if each becomes confident that the gains from a negotiation would outweigh the losses, then a group of influential countries, particularly from outside the conflict, might be able to broker a diplomatic settlement and set the stage for a more durable peace. If we assume a ceasefire is achievable, the parties to the conflict should aim at facilitating, the outside parties, not the two belligerents, should aim at facilitating direct talks between Russia and Ukraine on the terms of a permanent peace agreement. Such an agreement can conceivably be leave aside for the beginning of the process the thorny question of territorial boundaries. It is important to stress that international law does not condone the acquisition of land by force, but we can wait a little bit and try to settle that in a second moment. Entrenched and sanguine positions on this matter may suggest the institution of a temporary buffers or demilitarized zones, or small, as just was suggested, small zones in which there will be more humanitarian activity. One standing example, of course, is what is now the dividing line between North and South Korea. So of course, it has its own particulars. You cannot equate both situations, but this has been tried and done before. Setting buffer zones between belligerents.
We are observing a new model of a so-called great power rivalry. And the model is the model that is being imposed by the West and by the United States in particular. While the model is that while avoiding the all-out nuclear conflict, there is a need to weaken as much as possible both Russia and maybe even more China by creating along their borders a series of hostile countries, pumping weapons there and letting them create problems for Russia and China, maybe together, maybe separately, doesn't matter. Very dangerous trends are now very obvious in the Western Pacific or in Far East Asia, whatever you look at it from. I'm talking about the same region. Over the years, suddenly, not suddenly, but step by step, the NATO borders were moving east. And the more they were moving, the more there was a hysteria about the Russian threat. Of course, it so happened that NATO borders were coming closer and closer to Russia, and Russia is a great military power as well. So the threat was growing for those territories of NATO that were coming closer and closer to Russia. Now, that has to be understood. And finally, with the coup d'etat in Kiev, which violated the Budapest Memorandum because the coup d'etat was assisted by the United States, and with the passive attitude of Germany and France to that, Ukraine, as a result, moved away from a number of basic principles that were in the foundation of its independence. I'm talking specifically about the Declaration of Independence that was taken by Ukraine or adopted. I think it was 1990 or 91, not sure, but not earlier, not later, which proclaimed Ukraine as a neutral and non-nuclear country. I remember that well because that produced a shocking effect in the Russian military system, in the sense that they didn't want to withdraw nuclear weapons from Ukraine. And Ukraine wanted those nuclear weapons to be withdrawn. Then something else started to happen. Well, thank you. I apologize for this, but I think that discussion about these things would not really be productive. We need to keep these things in mind. We need to, let's say, impress on all parties involved, and these are more than just two parties which are involved, so that they make an effort to understand all the variety of concerns, fears, let's say, perceptions. In that sense, negotiations on, well, not negotiations, process towards new European security structure or architecture, of course, would be helpful. But if the ceasefire is difficult to achieve, that would be even more difficult to start before certain other things take place.
Now, we've seen now a lot of talking about the war from above. What, Lula should do and what this country should impress on this country, and it's a great power conflict and this and that. I think what we should do is look at the war a little bit from below, from the ground, from the side of the people that are actually victims of this war. Because then it becomes not a matter of great power politics, but a matter of human morals to actually go for an end of the conflict, for an end of the suffering. And I say this even if it involves certain types of compromise.